I'd like to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Peter Ross is the Vice President of Research at OceanWise with the Vancouver Aquarium. Dr. Ross is one of the top researchers in the world on microplastics and microfibers in our oceans, especially their impact on wildlife. He works with a number of recreation companies such as REI and Patagonia to help identify solutions to the microfibers shedding off their products. Please welcome Dr. Peter Ross.
Thank you. I guess I can choose a microphone. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here down from Vancouver. It's a short drive, if you don't count the border. Hour and a half yesterday waiting, but anyway, delighted to be here. It's a Saturday, which means this is free time. Okay, so let's turn it off maybe. This is free time for most of you, if not all of you, so thank you for your time. That's precious. We all have other things to do. We have families. We have fun things to do. We have errands. But something has drawn everyone to this room this morning, and it's a singular word, a singular topic, and that's, I believe, plastic. So one of the great things about that word, in my view, is exactly what it's doing to draw us together like this. I've been working as a marine pollution specialist for 30 years now, and I've never had industry knocking at my door saying, help. And I've never had a pollution topic or a pollution threat that has drawn as much energy and as many people from as many sectors as we're seeing today. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to talk through a couple of those points a little bit more in my presentation. I have about 18 or 19 slides, so if I don't ramble on too much, there'll be time for Q&A. But I also recognize that I'm speaking to the converted. So I don't want to preach. I want to talk about what we're discovering, give you a little bit of a foundation in terms of my perceptions of the state of knowledge, in terms of research. And hopefully that provides a little bit more insight into what's going on and enables some good hard-hitting questions. And I also acknowledge there are a number of other speakers that will complement my presentation very nicely and add to that knowledge bank. The starting point for all of us is not new. Plastic has been recognized as a threat to wildlife for decades. I grew up seeing terrible pictures of sea turtles eating plastic bags and seals getting tangled up in fishing nets, albatross out in the mid-Pacific skimming the surface, picking up little bits of plastic, colorful little pieces of plastic that they thought were food. And they picked it up, swallowed it, took it home to their chicks, fed it to their chicks, and unfortunately a lot of death and destruction for these species in particular, for albatross. So it's not new. I think everybody in this room acknowledges they've seen some of these terrible visuals. They've grown up understanding that plastic and or debris and or litter is a problem. And there were steps made in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s on a national and international scale to address threats associated with plastic and marine debris and fishing activities and derelict fishing gear, etc. So there have been a number of steps along the way stemming from science, from public concern, conservation concern, and from legitimate business and government oversight of these issues. So that's in the backdrop, and a lot of people struggle. I get this question sometimes, where did this recent infatuation with plastic pollution come from? And it forces me to reflect on why people are suddenly so interested in plastic. And there are a number of reasons for that. And I think if you all spent 3 or 4 minutes jotting down a few notes, you'd be able to articulate 2 or 3 reasons why plastic has exploded into the global environmental consciousness. I will speak to a few of those things today. One of the things that has led to this explosion in interest has been this sudden realization that plastic of any size and shape is going to break down physically but not chemically. This sets plastic apart from any other chemical pollutant that we are typically concerned about, and it sets it apart from the normal regulatory procedures or risk assessment practices that governments would go about regulating chemicals on. So harmful substances, we have processes and protocols in our national capitals to address these things. We have risk assessment frameworks to be able to assess toxicological information and look at the likelihood of harm down that road into the environment or into human health, the two ways in which we look at harm. And this is absolutely key. Plastic, in general terms, is never going to break down chemically, all right? So it has no half-life chemically, but it will break down or break up physically. So this is what's really novel. So it means that any plastic item that you are consuming or using today is going to be around in 1,000 years, is going to be around in 10,000 years. What's going to happen to that product, though, is it'll break down or break up into smaller and smaller pieces. So microplastics, simply put, is something that are defined as smaller than 5 millimeters. Excuse me, smaller than 5 millimeters. That's it. It's not very romantic from a science perspective. That's the definition. So it's a structural definition. It's not a chemical definition. There are tens of thousands of polymers out there. If you look at any plastic product, there are lots of additives, which you'll hear about shortly, and there are colorants, there are hardening agents, softening agents, flame retardants, all sorts of things that are added to plastics that will shape their fate and their toxicity as we move ahead. The two types of microplastic particles that we generally refer to, just to simplify a little bit, are primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. How many people have found nurdles on nearby beaches? Hands up. Nurdles. That's pretty good. How many people know what nurdles are? That's pretty good. So nurdles are the commercial feedstock. They're 3 to 7 millimeters, so they're borderline microplastics. Commercial feedstock for plastic products. So if you want to make a chair out of plastic, you might phone up a supplier and say, hey, I need 1,000 kilos of polypropylene to make a chair, or polyethylene to make a bottle or something, and you'll get them delivered in bags of nurdles. Problem is, these nurdles are slipping into the environment throughout their journey. They're falling off docks, they're falling off trucks, they're rinsing out of factories, they're in parking lots, they're falling out of container ships at sea, etc. Those are primary microplastics. We know what they are, and we can figure out where they come from, and we can regulate them. That's what knowledge delivers. The other type of primary microplastics are microbeads. How many people know about microbeads? Probably everybody. So both Canada and the US actually stepped in and said no more microbeads in pharmaceuticals and personal care products. That's pretty good. Europe was behind North America in that regard, so that's pretty good. Thank you very much, Heather. So those are primary microbeads. I would call this one of the world's dumbest ideas. Let's put 10,000 particles of plastic into your mouth with a bunch of toothpaste so you can scrub around and then spit it into the ocean. Dumb idea? Dumb idea. We've got alternatives to that. The interesting thing here, though, is that when you have a dumb idea that one can identify, one can track it to source and deal with it from a regulatory or best practice standpoint. So dumb ideas, let's regulate them. Low-hanging fruit, that's what microbeads were. The bigger monkey in the room or gorilla in the room are secondary microplastics. Secondary microplastics are the mystery particles out there in the environment that we know less about. Why? Because they're ill-defined. They're various shapes, colors, sizes, and they're coming from the breakdown of, or breakup, of all plastic products. So the last 50 years or 70 years of our disposal of plastic items is leading to the production of a lot of secondary microplastics. So this would be bottles and bags and bottle caps and straws and packaging and nets and textiles. So secondary microplastics is what I typically focus on. Much more difficult to understand, much more difficult to track back to source, and of course, very difficult to regulate or act upon. Just a background or a little bit on our plastics lab and how we go about our business, because it's important to understand that the science underlying the whole microplastic pollution crisis is evolving, and there are challenges with regard to common techniques and approaches being carried out by different labs, because you're not looking at a chemical, again, you're looking at structures. And every single plastic particle is unique. So I liken it to snowflakes, if you know the analogy. Every snowflake has a different form. Every snowflake is unique. That means you've got an infinite number of permutations, combinations in terms of size and shape and color and constituency. So it makes it very difficult for us scientists to step up and do a good research project and be able to compare lab A with lab B with lab C. The basic tool for the microplastic scientist is the microscope. Let's look at a sample, however it's collected, and let's measure it, length, width, let's document its color, let's count. And probably 95% of the literature, and that means scientific publications out there, stop right there. They just count the particles they suspect of being microplastics. And we now know that the false positives, in other words, there was an error rate, there was an overestimation, can be as high as 75%. That means that as much as 75% of the microplastic particles that are being reported or have been reported in the literature are actually not plastic. They're natural fibers and little bits and pieces. So we're seeing lots of stuff in the ocean, of course, and it's not all plastic. So really important to do another step, which is what we do in our lab, this lower right photograph, which is called an FTIR. There are different technologies, but this one, Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. How many people have one of those at home? Nope. About $350,000. Really cool instrument. You don't need any chemicals to extract no solvents, no harmful chemicals in the lab. This is a material sciences unit that will use infrared to basically energize a particle, and within a minute you're going to get a unique fingerprint, infrared fingerprint, or a spectrum that will be not only unique, but you can compare it to a big library of infrared spectral signatures, and that allows you to figure out what that mystery particle is. So 2 things I can do with this. Number 1, confirm that the mystery particle we're looking at is plastic or not. That's important. I want to talk about plastic here. And secondly, if it is plastic, what kind of plastic is it? So if you're trying to track back those secondary microplastics to source, you better understand what it is, plastic or not. If it's plastic, is it polypropylene? Is it a mixture? What is it? So we've got 250,000 materials in our database that allows us to look at a lot of things that are going on. One of the big challenges we face, I'll speak to it very briefly, is weathering. These particles, their spectral signatures do vary. These particles get biofouled, UVB comes along, salt, temperature, age, etc. So these signatures do change. We're trying to understand that and document that, because understanding that is also very, very important to tracking these things back to source. And a few years ago, we published a couple of papers. One was our report in 2014 about the widespread distribution of microplastics in the Northeastern Pacific Ocean. So we were on a couple of big oceanographic cruises extending out to Station P, which is over 1,000 kilometers west of Victoria on southern Vancouver Island, and then around Vancouver Island. So you'll see with this heat map that the red and orange and green are higher concentrations, and the pink offshore are lower concentrations. Every single sample we took had microplastics in it, but the concentrations were far higher near shore. We averaged 3,200 particles per cubic meter in the Strait of Georgia, and we even attained over 9,000 particles per cubic meter in Queen Charlotte Strait on the north end of Vancouver Island. So fairly shocking numbers. Now, a cubic meter is 1,000 liters. So you get a quart of milk, that's basically a liter. It would be 9 particles per liter. So that's what we would find. Now, it's instructive to see that we find very high concentrations near shore, lower concentrations offshore. You've heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. That's for macro debris, and a lot of that is fishing gear. But that is a gyre that focuses and concentrates some of the big plastic items out in the North Pacific. But we see very high concentrations of these microplastics closer to our own urban centers and ports and our own activities. So that's the first thing that's instructive. The second thing is, what are these particles? Well, 80% were fibers near shore. 80% were fibers. This is what we see when we look at the Salish Sea under a microscope. So lots of different colors and shapes, but a lot of fibers. That's telling us something already. The second study we published shortly thereafter was looked at zooplankton. We found that 1 in every 20 to 1 in every 30 zooplankters, individuals, had consumed plastic. And that 100% of the plastic that had been consumed in the Salish Sea were fibers. So zooplankton, bottom of the food chain, absolutely critical to ocean productivity. Food for salmon, food for humpback whales are mistaking plastic for food. So people say, well, so what? Is that a problem? Well, it's hard for us to do cause and effect in the real world out there of Mother Nature. Typically, we look at harm in laboratory settings with single dose or single chemical exposures and carefully controlled circumstances. We don't know exactly what's going on in the field, but we do know, based on lab studies, that microplastics can elicit harm. And there's one thing that's quite clear. Without too much thinking, plastic is not very nutritious. So if you're eating plastic as a zooplankton, industry might say, well, show me the evidence. I'll say, well, it's not food. And they're mistaken for food, and it's not nutritious, okay? We can all agree on that one. But the other thing with plastic, as with many pollutants, is it tends to weaken individuals, slow them down. If they're hungry or artificially satiated, or they've got a gut blockage, or it's delivering certain additives to their body, they may become weaker, their immune system might not work as much, they may be more subject to or more vulnerable to predation or scavenging if they die. So the evidence often disappears in the real world. We've been doing a lot of work, 4 years now, up in the Arctic in collaboration with the federal government, with the Coast Guard in Canada, and with One Ocean Expeditions, which is an ecotourism outfit that runs trips through the Arctic. And these are the new data for 2016. We found microplastic in every single seawater sample, except for one in the Chukchi Sea in the Western Arctic. And we see a variety of concentrations, but the highest concentrations have emerged in the eastern. If you can get your bearings here, there's sort of Canada, Greenland, the North Pole, and right here you've got Alaska, just on the upper left here. This is the Canadian Arctic archipelago. This is Davis Strait. Greenland is right here. You've got the northern end of Norway right there. And you could see that the highest concentrations appear to be found in those waters coming in from the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, not the North Pacific. So that's interesting in and of itself. And again, we see this dominance of fibers. In fact, 91% of the microplastic particles that we're finding in Arctic seawater are fibers. Now we're looking just below the surface. We're not looking at floating plastic that would be biased towards things like polystyrene beads. We're getting seawater samples from the vessel's water intake, which is about 5 meters down. So we would refer to those as kind of neutrally buoyant particles. But we're seeing a lot of fibers again. So the question is, where are these fibers coming from? This was a sample we collected in the harbor just off downtown Vancouver at the cruise ship terminal. It's fairly typical. We see strands of different sizes and different colors, sometimes tangled up when they're quite long. And as I think most of you know, there's been some evidence over the years that polyester, among other things, might be shedding during our home laundry. In fact, some of the earlier studies suggested that as many as 10 million fibers could be lost in a single wash from a polyester fleece. How many people wearing polyester fleece here today? Yeah? We love it, don't we? Vancouver Victoria, Seattle, Bellingham, we love our fleece here. So the problem is, fleece is a shredded polyester. It's not a woven polyester, it's a shredded product. We've taken polyester and shredded into these 12 to 15 micron thick strands, and we've woven those together or plated those together, and they're very vulnerable to degradation. And during the lifetime of your polyester fleece, if you weighed it when you bought it and you weighed it 5 years later, you would be able to notice a change, 3 to 5% loss of weight of your product. All right, so that's your fleece. So the wash is a culprit and a suspect in terms of releasing fibers to the environment. And some companies are quite concerned about this, and this is where industry did come knocking on our door and said, we're worried about this. Is there something that you can tell us about the origin of the fibers that you're finding in the ocean, and is there some ownership that we can take on in terms of this issue? Because we were not aware of it. We, as apparel companies or outdoor retailers, don't want to be blamed for this. We didn't intend for our products to degrade like this. So if there's something we missed in terms of awareness, we want to know. So I do give them credit for that. We have a number of enterprises, Patagonia and REI in the States, Arc'teryx and Mountain Equipment Co-op in Canada, and then we have the federal government and Metro Vancouver, which is our regional government. It's like King County here. They run the wastewater treatment plant facilities in Vancouver. So these partners stepped up, and we formed a microfiber partnership to say, hey, let's look at textiles, apparel, let's look at home laundry, let's look at wastewater treatment plants, and let's look at the receiving environment. Can we actually track from source to sink or sink to source and give ourselves a collective bit of insight into this issue? And can this help us design better products, control emissions, clean up at the wastewater treatment plant sort of technology and engineering scale, or otherwise? And other options, of course, would be regulations of some kind. But the first thing to look for is guidance on where the significance of this influx of particles might be from our homes. We set up a washing machine test center in Vancouver. Got 3 industrial washing machines. We we built some accessories on the back to sample the effluent coming out of each wash. And then we talked to our 4 apparel retailers, and we said, give us a whole bunch of your items that you're interested in us testing. And we got a standardized 500-gram sample from each of these materials. We got 110 textiles. 110 we're testing in our weathering study, that's part B, and 38 of them we actually put through a series of 5 consecutive washes. Unfortunately, it's a lot of water, but suffice to say that it's allowing us to document and to come up with some fairly clear ideas as to what the behavior of these different textiles might be and how vulnerable they are to losing fibers. Sure enough, they lose fibers. Actually, you guys, know it or not, you should be aware that your clothing does lose fibers. You don't get that evidence at home from your washing machine. Where do you get it from? Your dryer. So you know that clothes do this. The strange part of this story is we all clean out our dryer lint traps, right? And even the ducts we're supposed to. Insurance companies say clear out your ducts every year, otherwise you may be vulnerable to fire. What about the washing machine? Washing machines in North America, one major brand had a lint trap installed in the machine until the early 80s, when they removed it because of complaints from consumers about that musty, mildewy smell. They weren't cleaning out the lint trap properly. Some companies in Asia have lint traps on them. So the issue has been around for quite a while, but I just want to put it out there that everyone in this room knows a lot more about lint than you might have otherwise appreciated. So the issue with washing machines is one that we're looking at. And what we found with the 38 textiles that we've evaluated was there was a wide range from 3,000 to 3.5 million fibers lost in a single laundry from a 500-gram swatch of textiles. So that's akin to a small fraction of an overall laundry load. It's smaller than a single item of clothing. So fairly small, up to 3.5 million microfibers per sample per wash. Another point was that there was a range in releases, and that depended on the type of textile and the weave, so the product. So not all textiles are equal, and the loss of fibers varied over consecutive washes. Some textiles lost a lot at first wash, others lost more in subsequent washes. So it depended a little bit on the type of material and the textile itself. And we're just finishing up this week our final report to our partners, but in very general terms, here's a snapshot of some of the behaviors of our textiles. So we've got 3 categories here: natural, polyester, and nylon. And so one interesting thing here is that natural textiles, by that I mean things like cotton, are losing more fibers, more lint, than the polyester and nylon. Okay, a little bit counterintuitive, and let's circle around back to that in a little bit more detail subsequently. Polyester was next, and then nylon. So all these textiles that we're looking at are losing fibers, natural quite a bit, and it does raise the question, the wider question about the full life cycle analysis or approach to understanding textiles in our lives, because some of the natural fibers are very heavily reliant on water and pesticides. So it's not necessarily an argument to move towards polyester based on this, or you may want to rethink whether you move to natural products. So this is all part of the LCA, the life cycle analysis conversation that industry goes through, and we can circle back to that later. The second part of our study was looking at microplastics in a wastewater treatment plant. We published this paper last year whereby we documented the annual input and output of microplastics at Vancouver's largest wastewater treatment plant. So this services about 1.4 million people. And we looked at influent, that's primary influent, primary effluent, secondary effluent, into the environment and in the biosolids. And we basically calculated that every year 1.8 trillion particles of synthetic particles were entering the wastewater treatment plant. And that 71% of these were fibers, so again, that dominance of fibers. Most of the fibers were polyester and modified cellulose, so rayon, things like rayon. Still, the interesting thing here is that as particles, wastewater treatment plants are pretty effective at retaining them. So we saw 99% retention in the plant. That's based on primary and secondary processes. So that's a good news story. But the bad news, 2 bits of bad news, 30 billion particles still entering the ocean every single year. And perhaps the more insidious, the more challenging question for us all is the last one, and that is that the particles, the 99% of particles that are retained are then redistributed as fertilizers for mining, reclamation, and some forms of agriculture and forestry. Lots of questions. Remember, plastic doesn't break down chemically. I mentioned our weathering study. This is still underway. We've exposed a lot of these textiles, the 110 textiles, to the elements, atmosphere, ocean, and wastewater, and we're tracking their signatures over time. That's going to inform our forensic evaluation of sink to source. So we find a mystery particle in the ocean. If the infrared spectrum doesn't match, what can we do to better understand that spectrum to be able to really go back to that generalized source and inform? Just in heading into closing here, I don't want to put all of the blame onto clothing because we recognize that plastic and microplastic is coming from everything. And in fact, when we look at our samples under a microscope, we see a whole variety of different particles. It's not just fibers, it's not just textile-based fibers. There are a lot of those, but there are a lot of other things. We see things like rubber and paint chips. We see nurdles and microbeads. We see polystyrene. We see fragments and sheets, which are the secondary or the breakdown products from all of those various items that we can imagine. So let's remember that plastics in many ways is a very complicated story, but it's also a fairly simple story. I'm going to end up here with just a few thoughts to try to unify the complicated story. First of all, this is a global issue. We're finding plastic everywhere, absolutely everywhere. The deepest trenches of the ocean, the remote polar regions, seawater, air, mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, shellfish, zooplankton, baby fish, whales, seals. We're finding plastic everywhere. And it's increasing rapidly everywhere. It's a complicated story, but it's a simple story. I think this is where we need to refocus our efforts. We need to recognize both the complexity of the issue, hence the challenges, but also the simplicity of the issue. In other words, there are a fairly modest number of sort of low-hanging entities that we can tackle in order to unify our approaches to tackling the plastic pollution crisis. Third, all roads lead to microplastics. It's really important for us to realize that, you know, we sometimes walk down a beach and we see a buoy or a bottle cap, and we say, oh, there's a whole bunch of those. If I pick that up, it's not going to do anything. But think of that empty water bottle and imagine where it might be 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years from now, and realize that it's going to break down, and that product represents a latent reservoir for future microplastics. So that's where cleanups are helpful. Band-Aid, but we got to do it, all right? Next, we're all connected to the ocean. I think the textile, laundry, wastewater story is meaningful there, because what it means is every time you do laundry, and I'm preaching to the converted, I know that, you're very well aware of this, but the plastic issue, we are clearly connected with our textiles, with our clothing economy to the ocean, and that provides a bit of a unifying theme for science, for conversation about best practices, and for our own behaviors as consumers and homeowners or renters. You're not alone. Sometimes you feel alone in a dark and dreary world where everything seems to be going to hell in a handbasket, but you're not alone. And what strikes me about the plastic issue is that people are being drawn into the same room from a whole variety of sectors. And that does include private industry, lead agencies, federal agencies, different countries, the international community, conservation organizations, school groups. You're not alone, and that's what we need. We need to rally around the team on this one. And finally, the plastic pollution crisis, and I call it a crisis, is tractable. It's tractable because we can do things about it, and you are doing things about it, and that's wonderful. And the difference between plastic and other pollution issues, important ones like climate, like greenhouse gases, is that everyone gets the plastic pollution crisis. Everyone gets it. All ages and stages, they all get it, and that gives us an audience to engage, that gives us an audience for action, and there is expectation, as everyone knows in this room, that we do proceed with good practices to address the problem. I'm going to leave you with this infographic from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. If you don't know the MacArthur Foundation, look up, there are a couple of free PDFs that are wonderful reports that encapsulate the global plastic economy. And this is where we want to head towards a closed loop economy on plastic, whereby there's more recycling, more reuse, and less leakage. And that will speak to the value, retaining the value in the plastic products, viewing it as a resource. Did you know that every year, globally, we're throwing away $120 billion in packaging? 95% of packaging is lost to landfill or the environment. That's $120 billion. Wow, that's a big piece of pie for the innovators in the room. And I know there are lots of enterprising individuals and companies that are trying to deal with some of those things. So thanks very much for your time, and I hope I wasn't preaching too much. I know the audience is a friendly one, but it's a great topic. It's an important topic, and it's not the only topic. Lots of other environmental topics that we are probably also worried about. But this one can serve to inform those other issues like climate change as well. So that's where I get quite optimistic, is if we can use this as an ambassador to the wider world of pollutants out there, we're doing a good job. So thanks very much.
We'll now take questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to get the mic to you. And please keep them quick so that we can get as many questions in as we can.
Okay, I'm wondering what the connection to carbon release in manufacturing of textiles.
Yep, great question. And the MacArthur Foundation, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, came out with a report on the global textiles economy last February, I believe. So Ellen MacArthur Foundation, M-A-C, MacArthur, and they estimate that the global textiles industry is responsible today for something like 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's estimated to increase to 26% by the year 2050. So textiles, fast fashion, has been kind of ignored, if you will, in the climate change books, and I think it's a really important observation.
More questions?
So you touched on wastewater treatment plants and their connection to the distribution of fibers throughout the environment. So some wastewater treatment plants are transitioning to using biosolids and giving them a second life as compost. Sounds like there's probably some potential hazards with that. Is there some sort of mitigation that wastewater treatment plants can do to change that?
Yeah. So that's obviously it's a key question. The best thing one can do with wastewater treatment plants is, first of all, acknowledge that they're not designed to deal with the 500,000 chemicals we have on the market. They're at the receiving end. They've got fairly simple procedures and mechanical sort of techniques to deal with solids, particles, nutrients, pathogens, and almost by default, they're simply having to tackle a whole wide range of different issues. Wastewater regional authorities that oversee wastewater treatment plants would prefer that contaminants don't get into their influent in the first place, and they're good source control or education programs dealing with amalgam, mercury in dentist offices, oil from automotive shops, fats and grease from restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. So the best thing is to prevent harmful contaminants from getting into the wastewater stream in the first place. And that's where I think source control in the home or design of products that are shedding less or releasing less into the wastewater stream is more meaningful. That said, there are a few groups globally looking at wastewater to see if microplastics could be removed. It's not going to be destroyed, but there are ways to remove microplastic particles from wastewater. What we found in our lab is if you leave it in until the biosolids stage, you're not going to get them out. It's very hard. It's almost like cement. You're not getting the plastic particles out. So I think there are, what we need is action at multiple levels along the road. But yes, there are some opportunities, I think, for wastewater treatment plant authorities to incorporate some changes, and hopefully there'll be some cost-effective approaches in that regard.
I know we have lots more questions, but unfortunately we are right up against our clock. So I'm going to have to stop it there. But let's give Dr. Ross a hand again for coming tonight.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much.